Hello everyone, welcome to the ERS Military Report. I have spent 3 decades observing how American presidents handle military crises. I have seen measured responses, carefully calibrated escalation ladders, and diplomatic off-ramps engineered with precision to avoid the very direct confrontation that turns a regional conflict into something the entire world pays for. I have watched governments navigate the space between credibility and catastrophe with varying skill and varying success. But in 30 years of observation, I have never witnessed an American president wake up to the news that 4 destroyers of the United States Navy were sunk in a single engagement with 1,200 dead or missing American sailors, while the responsible state had already announced it would do it again if the response crosses a threshold it unilaterally defines. That is the situation Donald Trump was confronted with this morning, and the response he ordered: the full mobilization of American retaliatory capability across every available domain has set in motion a clock over the Strait of Hormuz and the wider Middle East that is now measured not in days, but in hours. In Trump's Washington, even the clock seems louder when someone discovers that slogans do not intercept missiles. This is what has occurred. At 23:47 local time, units of the Iranian Aerospace Forces and naval elements of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps launched a coordinated strike package of 300 missiles, a combination of Kalfa anti-ship ballistic missiles, anti-ship cruise missiles, and Fatah-2 hypersonic glide vehicles against the American destroyer squadron operating in the waters between Karg Island and the entrance to the Strait of Hormuz. The USS Gravely, USS Nitsa, USS Mason, and USS Forrest Sherman were operating in a patrol configuration that had become routine in recent weeks. It was a presence mission intended to signal American commitment to freedom of navigation through the world's most strategically important maritime choke point. That routine collapsed into catastrophe in less than 20 minutes. The strike package was designed with a level of sophistication that the U.S. Navy tactical community will study for years. The Kalfa ballistic missiles, which in their terminal phase flew at hypersonic speed, arrived first and simultaneously saturated the standard missile defense systems of all 4 destroyers. The cruise missiles, flying at very low altitude in sea-skimming profiles, exploited the gaps created by this saturation and targeted the remaining defenses whose interceptors had already been expended against the first wave. The Fatah-2 hypersonic glide vehicles, maneuvering in their terminal phase to defeat every remaining interception attempt, completed the engagement sequence. All 4 destroyers were struck by multiple weapons. All 4 were assessed as total losses within 40 minutes of the first impact. The waters off the island of JSK became within those 40 minutes the site of the heaviest single naval loss for U.S. forces since the Second World War. Trump's response was immediate, personal, and operationally unambiguous. Within 2 hours of receiving the damage assessment, he authorized full mobilization of American retaliatory capability and issued a public statement, leaving no room for diplomatic interpretation. The press conference followed almost as quickly as the crisis, because in modern politics, the first counterstrike is often a microphone. The Middle East is now only hours away from the most consequential military confrontation since the Gulf War. And the question every government in the world urgently asks, whether the American response can achieve its objectives without triggering consequences that spiral beyond control, has no reassuring answer. This analysis develops the questions defining this moment. How did 300 Iranian missiles defeat the world's most advanced naval air defense systems and send 4 American destroyers to the bottom of the Gulf of Oman? What does the technical execution of this engagement reveal about Iranian anti-ship warfare capability that the Pentagon catastrophically underestimated? What does Trump's order for full retaliation actually mean operationally? Which forces are being mobilized? Which targets are being selected? And which escalation thresholds separate a limited military exchange from a regional war the global economy cannot survive? Why is the Strait of Hormuz and Iran's demonstrated willingness to turn it into a death zone the variable that makes every American escalation option more dangerous than any war game has ever admitted? And when retaliation begins and Iran responds as it has already promised, where does it end and who, if anyone, can stop it before the point of no return is reached? Now, we go through this in full. Part 1. 300 missiles, 4 destroyers, 20 minutes, the anatomy of a naval catastrophe. From a professional perspective, the strike Iran carried out against the American destroyer squadron off JSK represents the most sophisticated anti-ship engagement in the history of modern naval warfare. I use this characterization carefully and want to explain why it is justified. To understand how 4 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers were sunk in less than 20 minutes, one must understand both the technical sophistication of what Iran deployed and the specific vulnerabilities in U.S. naval air defense architecture that this engagement ruthlessly exploited. The Arleigh Burke-class destroyer is the backbone of U.S. naval air defense. Its Aegis combat system, the most capable shipborne air defense architecture ever deployed, integrates an SPY-1 radar, standard missile interceptors, and a combat management system capable of tracking and engaging multiple targets across a wide spectrum of threats simultaneously. In any honest assessment of maritime capability, the Arleigh Burke class represents the gold standard of surface ship air defense. 4 of them operating in coordinated formation with overlapping radar coverage and shared targeting data form an air defense shield that no single threat category can reliably penetrate. Iranian operational planners understood this. They designed a strike package not to defeat Aegis in a fair fight, because no fair fight against Aegis produces the outcome Iran required, but to defeat it by presenting multiple threat categories simultaneously across the full spectrum of engagement difficulty in quantities and sequences that exhausted its intercept capacity before the most dangerous weapons arrived. The opening salvo of 120 Kalfa anti-ship ballistic missiles was the forcing move. The Kalfa is a maneuvering re-entry vehicle designed specifically for use against ships. It detects and tracks surface vessels in its terminal phase and adjusts its trajectory to compensate for target movement. At hypersonic speed in the terminal phase, it presents an interception geometry that pushes the Standard Missile 3 to the edge of its performance envelope. 4 destroyers, with a combined inventory of approximately 80 SM-3 missiles, were simultaneously confronted with 120 incoming ballistic threats. The mathematics of this exchange, 80 interceptors against 120 targets, each engagement requiring radar time, interceptor flight time, and kill assessment before the next engagement could begin, led to an unavoidable outcome. The SM-3 inventory was exhausted before all 120 ballistic threats were engaged. Into the gaps created by this exhaustion came the second wave of 110 low-altitude cruise missiles. The Iranian variant of the Chinese C-802 flies its terminal approach at 5 to 10 meters above sea level, using sea-skimming flight to remain below the radar horizon of defending ships until it reaches a range that allows minimal interception reaction time. Against Standard Missile 2, point defense systems already under cognitive load, managing ballistic threats simultaneously, the sea-skimming cruise missiles presented an engagement geometry that overwhelmed the remaining defensive capacity. Standard Missile 2 interceptors were expended against the Waterway and further depleted the defensive inventory. The third wave, 70 Fateh 2 hypersonic glide vehicles arriving in the final phase of the engagement sequence, struck 4 destroyers whose interceptor stocks were severely exhausted, whose defensive system performance had degraded due to the continuous tempo of the preceding waves, and whose combat management computers were operating at the limits of their processing capacity. The maneuvering terminal phase of the Fateh 2 defeated the remaining Standard Missile 6 interception attempts. Multiple weapons struck each ship. The fires, flooding, and catastrophic structural damage resulting from multiple hypersonic warhead impacts against vessels whose defensive systems had been deliberately depleted before the most lethal weapons arrived, led to 4 total losses in less than 20 minutes. The operational lesson, simply put, is that a layered saturation approach in anti-ship warfare, when executed with sufficient mass across multiple threat categories, can defeat even the most advanced available ship-based air defense system. The US Navy leadership knew this in theory. JSK proved it operationally. That is the brutal difference between a PowerPoint warning and a burning hull. One is discussed in a conference room, the other ends the discussion. Part 2. Trump's retaliation order, what full mobilization actually means. When Donald Trump, in the context of 1,200 dead or missing American sailors and 4 destroyers on the seabed, uses the term full retaliation, the operational content of that phrase is not rhetorical. Having observed American military planning culture up close, I can say that the target packages, troop deployment orders, and escalation authorizations implied by full retaliation represent a level of military action against Iran that would amount to the most extensive direct US strike campaign against a regional power since the invasion of Iraq in 2003. The immediate picture of force mobilization is already partially visible. 3 carrier strike groups, the USS Gerald R. Ford, the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower, and the USS Harry S. Truman, have been ordered to concentrate in operational areas in the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea. The combined air wings of these 3 carriers amount to roughly 250 combat aircraft capable of sustained strike operations against Iranian targets that no Iranian air defense system can fully absorb. B-2 Spirit stealth bombers have been redeployed from their home bases to forward staging positions within range of Iranian territory, signaling intent to employ deep penetration munitions against hardened underground targets that conventional aircraft cannot reliably destroy. Submarine-launched Tomahawk missile packages have been positioned against a target list maintained and refined by US intelligence for years. That target selection is extensive and reflects years of intelligence collection against Iranian military infrastructure. Iranian air defense systems, including S-300 batteries and indigenous Bavar 373 systems protecting Iranian airspace, are top priority targets because suppression of Iranian air defenses is a prerequisite for sustained air operations. Iranian ballistic missile production facilities and underground complexes where the weapons that sank 4 American destroyers are manufactured are high-priority targets whose destruction would degrade Iran's future strike capability. Naval bases of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps along the Makran coast, the launch and coordination points of the JSK strike, are priority targets intended to reduce Iran's ability to repeat such an operation. And nuclear infrastructure, which has been the underlying driver of US-Iran confrontation for 2 decades, appears on every serious US war planner's target list. What Trump's full retaliation order does not include, and this is the operationally significant omission, is a defined end state. The order specifies what US forces are permitted to strike, but not what outcome those strikes are intended to achieve, nor what level of Iranian response would be considered acceptable, nor what escalation would trigger further American action. This ambiguity is not accidental. It reflects the real strategic difficulty of defining achievable objectives in a military confrontation with Iran, a difficulty any honest assessment must acknowledge. A policy without an end state is not a strategy. It is a very expensive sentence with fighter jets attached. Destroying Iranian military infrastructure does not eliminate Iran's military capability, because that capability is distributed, hardened, and in large part housed in underground facilities specifically designed to survive precisely the type of air campaign American forces now appear to be preparing. Destroying nuclear infrastructure may delay the program by years, but it does not eliminate the knowledge, personnel, or institutional intent behind it. And any US strike campaign that kills Iranian military personnel and destroys Iranian infrastructure will generate an Iranian response whose nature, scale, and target selection will be determined by Iran's own escalation logic, something no US wargame has reliably predicted. Part 3. The Hormuz variable, why every American option carries catastrophic risk. It must be stated clearly, every US military option available in this situation carries the risk of producing consequences that far exceed the original provocation in global economic impact. The variable that makes this true, the factor that transforms a serious bilateral military confrontation into a potentially civilizational economic event, is the Strait of Hormuz. 21 million barrels of oil pass through the Strait of Hormuz every day. Roughly one-third of global liquefied natural gas transits the same choke point. The economies of Japan, South Korea, China, India, and every major European nation are tied to the uninterrupted energy flow through this 21-mile waterway between the Iranian coast and the Omani Peninsula. If that flow is disrupted, not reduced, not threatened, but physically interrupted through sustained mining, missile, and naval interdiction campaigns that Iran demonstrably has both the capability and willingness to execute, global economic consequences begin within 72 hours and escalate to levels no state economic model is truly prepared for. Iran's ability to close the Strait of Hormuz in response to U.S. military action is not theoretical. It is operational. Iranian naval, aerospace, and missile assets positioned along the Makran coast and on islands within the strait, Abu Musa, Greater Tumb, Lesser Tumb, and a network of hardened coastal facilities built specifically for interdiction, form a layered anti-access system that U.S. naval forces cannot rapidly suppress without a sustained campaign that itself carries escalation risk. Minefields can be laid faster than they can be cleared. Coastal missile batteries can be destroyed, but replacement systems can be pushed forward from inland positions. Fast attack craft can be sunk, but replacements can be launched from hardened coastal shelters. The Strait of Hormuz is Iran's strategic leverage over the global economy, and any U.S. military action that threatens regime survival would likely trigger its use. The oil price dynamics of a closure are straightforward and alarming. Even a one-week disruption could drive prices from a baseline of roughly $80 to $90 per barrel to $200 to $300 or higher. A 2-week or longer closure would create supply shocks in Asia that strategic reserves alone could not offset. The inflationary, recessionary, and destabilizing effects would be global, with the most severe consequences in developing economies least able to absorb energy shocks. Trump's decision for full retaliation is politically understandable in domestic terms. 1,200 dead sailors and 4 destroyed destroyers demand a visible response proportional to the provocation. But the strategic logic underlying that political necessity cannot ignore the Hormuz variable. Domestic politics demands a clean ending. Strategy does not provide one. The Strait of Hormuz responds with a bill for the entire planet. The American response, which satisfies domestic political requirements, could trigger an Iranian reaction that produces a global economic catastrophe. This tension between what domestic politics demands and what the strategic situation can actually withstand is the most consequential challenge any U.S. president has faced since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And unlike John F. Kennedy in 1962, Trump is managing it in a media environment that leaves no room for the kind of quiet back-channel diplomacy that ultimately resolved that confrontation. Kennedy had back channels. Trump has cameras, applause lines, and a political ecosystem that treats restraint as a personal insult. Part 4. David versus Goliath. Why Iran does not blink. What I find most operationally significant about Iran's behavior in the hours since the JSK strike, and a dimension almost entirely missed by Western media, is the absence of any signal suggesting that the prospect of American retaliation is producing the kind of strategic reassessment that U.S. deterrence theory would expect. There has been no back-channel communication indicating willingness to negotiate. There has been no reduction in operational tempo, suggesting Iranian forces are slowing in anticipation of a diplomatic solution. Instead, there was a public statement from the leadership of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, explicitly acknowledging expected American retaliation, characterizing it as acceptable within Iran's strategic framework, and promising a response that Iranian spokespeople describe as deliberately disproportionate. This pattern reflects a coherent strategic calculation, once the framework in which Iranian decision-makers operate is understood. Iran did not sink 4 American destroyers because its leadership misjudged the American response. It did so because it concluded that the American response, including the full retaliation Trump has now ordered, is a price Iran can absorb, while the strategic benefits of demonstrating that U.S. naval power can be defeated in direct combat outweigh that cost in a way that made the moment worth it. This calculation rests on three core assessments developed and refined by Iranian strategists over years. First, that U.S. military action against Iran, regardless of scale and destructive power, cannot produce regime change capable of eliminating the Iranian threat, because the social, political, and institutional foundations of the Iranian state are more resilient than U.S. planners have repeatedly assumed. Second, that Iranian retaliatory capability, including the option of closing Hormuz, imposes escalation costs that limit how far U.S. response can practically go before global economic consequences become politically unbearable in Washington. Third, that the international political environment, with Russia and China providing diplomatic cover, the developing world offering moral support, and U.S. domestic political constraints limiting prolonged military engagement, restricts the duration and intensity of any American campaign in ways Iran believes it can outlast. The willingness underpinning this framework, the institutional belief that the costs of resistance are worth paying because the alternative is permanent subordination of Iranian sovereignty, was not created by the current leadership. It was forged over 50 years of external pressure that consistently produced the opposite of its intended effect. Every sanction that failed to produce compliance, every assassination that did not break the program, and every military threat that did not force strategic concessions added another layer to the conviction that external pressure is a problem to be solved, not a condition to accept. The 4 American destroyers on the seabed of JSK are the operational expression of that belief in its most consequential form. Washington repeatedly rediscovers that pressure is not automatically strategy. Sometimes it is only the sound of one side pushing while the other digs in deeper. Part 5. The Abyss. How the world looks on the other side of this night. My honest assessment, and I state this with the full clarity professional responsibility allows, is that the next 48 hours represent the most dangerous window in the Middle East since the Yom Kippur War of 1973. Not the most dangerous in terms of military balance between the immediate combatants, but in terms of the range of outcomes that could emerge from decisions now being made in Washington, Tehran, Moscow, Beijing, and the capitals of every nation whose energy security depends on the continuous flow of oil through the Strait of Hormuz. The optimistic scenario, the one in which U.S. strikes sufficiently degrade Iranian military capability to satisfy domestic demands for visible retaliation, Iran absorbs the strikes without triggering closure of Hormuz, and back-channel diplomacy produces a de-escalation framework neither side publicly acknowledges, requires a level of mutual restraint and tacit coordination between adversaries who are simultaneously killing each other's personnel and destroying each other's infrastructure. This scenario is not impossible. History contains examples of adversaries managing escalation under conditions that seem to preclude restraint. But it requires both sides to simultaneously calculate that the costs of further escalation exceed the benefits, and the signals currently coming from both Washington and Tehran suggest neither side has reached that calculation yet. In Moscow, the reaction to the JSK strike and the U.S. retaliation order has been calibrated to the millimeter. Public calls for restraint delivered in a tone that suggests private satisfaction with how events are unfolding. Russia bears no direct cost from a U.S.-Iran military confrontation. It benefits from diverted American attention and resources, from rising oil prices caused by any disruption of Hormuz, given its own hydrocarbon exports, and from any demonstration that U.S. military power has operational limits that a determined regional adversary with capable weapons can exploit. The Kremlin will not provide the off-ramp that prevents escalation. It has no incentive to do so. In Beijing, the calculation is more complex and more consequential. China is the largest single importer of Gulf oil. Roughly 40% of its imports pass through the Strait of Hormuz. A closure of Hormuz does not benefit China as it benefits Russia. It imposes costs severe enough to constitute a genuine strategic concern. But China's ability to shape the immediate situation is constrained by the same dynamic that has defined its posture throughout the conflict. It can call for restraint and offer mediation, but it cannot compel either side to accept conditions that contradict their strategic calculations. Chinese diplomatic influence is real, but insufficient to match the scale of the crisis. For the world that exists on the other side of the next 48 hours, whatever that world looks like, the strategic legacy of the JSK engagement is already fixed. Regardless of how the immediate crisis is resolved, 4 American destroyers were sunk in direct combat with Iranian forces. That fact cannot be erased diplomatically, reinterpreted strategically, or absorbed by the U.S. security establishment without forcing a fundamental reassessment of naval force posture, anti-ship defense architecture, and the assumptions that placed those 4 ships within range of 300 Iranian missiles without adequate protection against the specific threat combination that destroyed them. The Middle East after this night is not the Middle East before it. The assumption of American naval invulnerability, the foundation of U.S. regional power projection for 3 generations, has been operationally broken. The deterrence architecture built on that assumption must now be reconstructed from its foundations, and that reconstruction will take place in a strategic environment permanently altered by the demonstration that a regional power with precision anti-ship weapons, operational will, and strategic patience can defeat the world's most powerful navy in a direct engagement under conditions of its own choosing. 4 destroyers, 300 missiles, 20 minutes, 1,200 sailors. These are the numbers that define what has happened. They are also the numbers that have set in motion a chain of events whose endpoint no one, in Washington, Tehran, Moscow, or Beijing, can confidently predict. Trump has ordered full retaliation. Iran has promised a disproportionate response. The Strait of Hormuz, the lifeline of the global economy, sits at the center of a military confrontation from which neither side has yet shown any inclination to step back. Once again, the world is being asked to trust that the loudest voice in the room also possesses the quietest exit strategy. History has not always rewarded that optimism. I have spent 30 years analyzing how military confrontations escalate and how they de-escalate. The honest conclusion from everything observable in this situation is that the path of de-escalation is narrow. It requires simultaneous goodwill from adversaries currently killing each other and depends heavily on external actors, especially China, whose interests do not fully align with the escalation outcome. The path of escalation is wide. It requires only that one side decide the other has crossed a threshold demanding response, and that the responding side's threshold logic cannot absorb that response without further escalation. The Middle East now has hours before American retaliation begins. What emerges in those hours, whether back-channel communication creates space for controlled de-escalation or domestic political pressures on both sides drive the confrontation past the point of controllability, will determine whether the global economy survives this crisis intact or pays a price measured in years of disruption. I will continue in the next breakdown.